This is South Sudan, the world's youngest country, a nation born out of hope. But today, that hope appears to be fading fast.
South Sudan is on the brink of another civil war.
Right now, peace is collapsing. Leaders are being arrested and international forces are scrambling to evacuate. Neighbors are picking sides and the country is on the brink of yet another civil war. But how did we get here? And why should the rest of the world care? I want to walk you through the journey South Sudan took to get here, to help you better understand how selfish interest and lust for power has resulted in the crisis leading to the collapse of this young country.
We're a tyrant in Juba who should be removed.
It all began in 1956, and with the British, of course. Britain and Egypt had just relinquished their colonial control over Sudan, leading to the formation of the newly independent Republic of Sudan. But right from before independence, the North and South have been seeing tension rising between them. These internal divisions triggered decades of violent conflict, including 2 civil wars, with the second one ending in 2005. So it's 2005. The Second Sudanese Civil War has just ended. Part of the agreement that brings this war to an end gives this southern part of the country some form of autonomy from the central government over in Khartoum. With this agreement in place, an autonomous government of South Sudan is formed with this guy Salva Kiir as the president of the government of Southern Sudan. This was following the death of a man called John Garang. Salva Kiir is also named the first vice president of Sudan. Alongside him is his colleague Riek Machar, who is also named vice president of the Southern Sudan Autonomous Region. From here, plans are set in motion for a full independence movement.
After years of bloody fighting, Southern Sudan's time has come. It's the first day of a week-long independence ballot in which voters will be asked whether they want to redraw the border, splitting the country in two.
Between 9th and 15th January 2011, the region holds a referendum to determine whether South Sudan should become an independent country separate from Sudan. The result is an overwhelming yes. 98.83% of those who take part in the referendum want independence. On July 9, 2011, South Sudan becomes the world's newest country. For many South Sudanese, this feels like a dream come true. The streets of Juba are packed with people celebrating. They had fought for this moment. The world watches on as this guy, Salva Kiir, wearing his signature cowboy hat, and his colleague Riek Machar stand side by side to usher in a new era. But beneath the surface, something is missing. South Sudan, you see, was built on a shaky foundation, and as the early independence euphoria died down, the cracks started to show. A few months later, it was reported that South Sudan was at war with at least 7 armed groups in 9 of its 10 states, with tens of thousands of people displaced. The fighters accused the government of plotting to stay in power indefinitely, not fairly representing and supporting all tribal groups while neglecting development in rural areas. From the get-go, the South Sudanese government was confronted with an impossible task of uniting a nation divided along tribal lines. But no one could have predicted what was to come. By December 2011, tribal clashes had intensified. The economy was fragile, institutions were weak, and critical infrastructures were non-existent, as the place had been devastated by conflict. Even though the country was rich in oil, it was landlocked and completely dependent on its neighbor, Sudan, to export it for them. Then the worst happened, when a dispute with Sudan over oil transit fees led South Sudan shutting down oil production in 2012, crippling its own economy as a result. From here, the crisis was blown wide open. You see, even though everyone was smiling during the Independence Day celebrations, it is crucial to note that South Sudan's leaders had never really stopped fighting. When they stopped aiming guns at the government over in Khartoum, they simply turned them on themselves. To understand what happens next, I need to tell you the story of President Kiir and his first vice president, Riek Machar. The man Salva Kiir was barely 4-year-old when the first Sudanese civil war broke out in 1955. This happened just a year before Sudan's independence. His father was a local chief in the Dinka ethnic group. His people have herded cattle in the heart of Bahr el Ghazal, a region of South Sudan, for centuries. And this was where he grew up, amidst echoes of war with the central government in Khartoum. Kiir, barely a child, saw soldiers march through his village. He saw chaos, hunger, and fear. The war defined his entire teenage years. By the late 1960s, Kiir, still a teenager, decided to take part in this struggle. He joined the Anyanya, the Southern rebel movement, fighting in the First Civil War. This was a pivotal moment for him. But while Kiir joined the rebel force to fight in the Sudanese Civil War, Riek Machar, who was born just 2 years after Salva Kiir in a small town in what is today Unity State, South Sudan, would take an entirely different path. Machar's father was also a local chief, but in the newer ethnic group. As the First Civil War neared its end, Machar found his way to Khartoum, from where he traveled abroad to the UK for studies at the University of Bradford. Back in Sudan, the civil war was still raging. Kiir and his Anyanya rebels had taken to the bush at this point, fighting brutally against the government in guerrilla warfare that led to the death of many of his comrades. By the time the war ended with the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972, granting the South a degree of autonomy, Kiir, like many young fighters, did not fully trust the peace process. He quietly remained connected to military networks, suspicious of Khartoum's promises. And just a few years later, his skepticism would prove prophetic. Having obtained a PhD in mechanical engineering in 1984, Riek Machar was ready to return home. A newer son returning from the West with a doctorate. That alone gave him immense status back home. But status, you see, wasn't enough, as Sudan was about to erupt yet again. 1980s introduced an interesting figure into the mix, John Garang, an ethnic Dinka. Garang was a US-trained economist and soldier who had returned from Iowa and Fort Benning with a vision far larger than what most Southern commanders in the First Sudanese Civil War could imagine. For Garang, the war was not just to gain autonomy for the South, but a completely new Sudan, where all marginalized people, whether in the South, the Nuba Mountains, or Darfur, could live in peace and dignity. When Kiir met Garang, he knew Garang to be an idealist, but his charisma and visionary leadership qualities won him over. Soon enough, they founded the Sudan People's Liberation Army, SPLA, in response to Khartoum's attempt to revoke the South's autonomy in 1983. But the relationship between Garang and Kiir was a complex one. You see, they didn't always agree, and there were tensions, especially over Garang's insistence on fighting for a unified Sudan rather than outright Southern independence. However, Kiir was fiercely loyal and rarely challenged Garang publicly. As war resumed in 1983, the new rebel force known as Sudan People's Liberation Army was looking for people to join in the fight against the brutality of the central government. And practically everyone lent their hand in the fight. One of those who joined forces with Garang and Kiir in the early days was this guy, Riek Machar. He wasn't just a soldier. He was educated, strategic, and immediately became one of Garang's key commanders. Together, they fought the Khartoum government, but under the surface, fault lines were forming. Kiir became Garang's right-hand man in the battles that followed. He knew how to command men in the bush, how to maneuver through swamps and deserts, and how to inspire discipline among weary fighters. His leadership style was deeply respected. His fighters knew he wasn't sitting in a comfortable office somewhere. He was right there with them, enduring the same hunger, the same bullets, and most importantly, the same betrayal when supposed allies defected to Khartoum. You see, in the early 90s, a rift beyond just politics was beginning to emerge within the SPLA group. Though officially multi-ethnic, the SPLA had a heavy Dinka dominance, both in leadership and the ordinary enlisted personnel. Both Garang and Kiir that were in the forefront of decision-making were ethnic Dinka. Machar and other commanders felt marginalized and accused Garang of running the SPLA like a personal territory. But it wasn't just about ethnicity now. Machar, just like Kiir before him, fundamentally disagreed with Garang's New Sudan project. For Machar, outright independence for the South and not unity with the North should be the only goal. This ideological divide, coupled with personal ambition, ethnic tension, and Garang's perceived authoritarian leadership style, led to an explosive moment within the group. And then in August 1991, Riek Machar, alongside Lam Akol, broke away from Garang's SPLA in what became known as the Nasir Declaration. But watch what they did next. Machar and his new allies accused Garang of dictatorship and declared their commitment to South Sudan's independence. However, they didn't just break the unity in the group. This division soon ignited one of the most devastating episodes of the Civil War. The growing tensions soon led to the Bor massacre, where Machar and his forces, largely of the Nuer ethnic group, attacked Bor, a Dinka town believed to be Garang's home area. Thousands of civilians were killed. This event left a permanent scar on the relationship between the Nuers and Dinka communities. As the rebellion began to take its toll on the SPLA leadership, Salva Kiir stood loyally by Garang. Together, they tried to salvage what was left of the group after the Machar-led split. But Riek Machar was not done with his betrayal of the group yet. In the mid-1990s, Machar made his most controversial move when he cut a deal with Khartoum's government, the very government the SPLA had been fighting. He would go on to form the South Sudan Defense Forces, SSDF, and became vice president of Sudan under Omar al-Bashir, the dictator that had been bombing his people all those years. This was hugely controversial. His people called him a sellout, but Machar fought back against his critics, saying he was simply buying time and seeking a pragmatic path to self-determination. In reality though, he found himself increasingly marginalized by Khartoum as well, used but never truly trusted. By the late 1990s, the SPLA under the leadership of Garang and Kiir had regained strength. International dynamics had shifted in their favor. Also, the central government in Khartoum was getting increasingly frustrated by the low revenue coming in. Soon enough, Omar al-Bashir looked for ways to fund his war machines as well as pay the usual bribes to his generals and personal militia. And so, he turned his attention to the oil fields in the south. He needed a way to clear what he called insurgency in the south for the government to construct pipelines and a refinery. But the SPLA were no pushovers. They quickly braced for what appeared to be a climax in the Civil War. By 2002, Machar returned to the SPLA. A mixture of political realism and shifting alliances had forced his decision. However, Garang, recognizing Machar's military strength and influence, especially among the Nuer community, welcomed him back. After 3 more brutal years of fighting, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, known as CPA, was signed in 2005, bringing an end to the Second Sudanese Civil War. Garang became first vice president of Sudan, and Machar, who had made some deals with al-Bashir after the split in the mid-90s, became his deputy in the government of Southern Sudan. Finally, it looked like these old rivals were destined to be the architects of South Sudan's future. But then, fate intervened, and in the most horrific manner. On July 30, 2005, only weeks after Garang was sworn in as Sudan's first vice president under the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, his helicopter went down in the hills of Southern Sudan. Garang was dead. This could have shattered the SPLA. Garang was the movement's symbol. His death could have triggered another civil war within the south, but Salva Kiir stepped up. He became chairman of the SPLA and vice president of Sudan. Machar once again became vice president, this time under Kiir as South Sudan edged closer to independence. But the old wounds, especially between Machar and the Dinka establishment, hadn't healed. Between 2005 and 2011, as vice president of Sudan and leader of Southern Sudan, Kiir masterfully navigated what appeared to be a minefield. He worked closely, though not always smoothly, with Omar al-Bashir's government. He knew Bashir feared another southern rebellion, so Kiir leveraged that to ensure the referendum would actually happen. At the same time, He had to carefully navigate a tense political atmosphere back home as some Southerners distrusted him for cooperating with Khartoum at all. When the referendum came in 2011, the overwhelming vote for independence was as much a reflection of Southern unity as it was of the deep scars from decades of war. But while both Kiir and Machar smiled and waved from the podium in Juba in July 2011, they knew the battle was far from over, especially with old wounds still left untreated. And this is where the story takes an even darker turn. After independence, Kiir inherited a fragile state with no real institutions, a traumatized population, and a force that had never truly transitioned from guerrilla movement to national army. Soon enough, tensions with his former comrade Riek Machar, now his vice president, escalated. In December 2013, a political rift in the ruling party turned violent when President Kiir accused Machar of trying to overthrow him. Gunfire soon broke out in Juba between factions of the army loyal to each man. What started as a political dispute rapidly exploded into a brutal civil war along ethnic lines. Kiir's Dinka-dominated forces turned on Machar's newer people, and the violence quickly spread across the country. The war was horrific. Both sides committed atrocities. Soldiers targeted civilians based on ethnicities, and massacres were reported in Juba and beyond. By early 2014, rebel forces, that is the SPLA in opposition, and government troops were engaged in brutal battles across several states. The conflict's toll was horrific. Hundreds of thousands were killed over the next 5 years, and nearly 4 million people, which is a third of the population, were uprooted from their homes. Hopes that oil wealth would bring prosperity were dashed by what the UN would later call a man-made catastrophe.
The oil fields are a target because he is buying more arms, more ammunition. He is doing more corruption by exploiting our resources.
As the fighting escalated, other countries became involved. Regional mediators from the Intergovernmental Authority on Development pushed for a truce as violence and atrocities mounted. Uganda intervened militarily in early 2014 to show up Kiir's government, with President Yoweri Museveni's troops helping fight rebels near Juba and in the strategic town of Boa, a place which was attacked by Machar in the mid-90s. But despite ceasefire deals on paper, fighting continued. At this point, the world had to step in. The United States, which had been a major supporter of South Sudan's independence, imposed sanctions on the leaders. China, which had deep investments in South Sudan's oil, deployed peacekeepers. Ugandan troops continued to help Kiir in his fight to retain control. Kenya and Ethiopia tried to mediate peace. The UN set up one of its largest peacekeeping missions. By 2015, this intense international pressure seemed to prevail. Kiir and Machar finally signed the agreement on the resolution of the conflict. With the agreement signed, Machar returned to Juba in 2016 to form a unity government as vice president, but the peace was short-lived. In 2016, another round of violence erupted in Juba, forcing Machar to flee yet again. Hundreds of people, including UN peacekeepers, were killed in this renewed violence. The collapse of the 2015 deal plunged South Sudan back into war. By now, the humanitarian crisis was overwhelming. In early 2017, the UN declared a famine in parts of South Sudan with 100,000 people facing starvation and 1 million more on the brink. At this point, an estimated 400,000 people had died in this conflict. In 2017 and 2018, a series of ceasefires were negotiated and subsequently violated between the two sides and other factions. After nearly 5 years of civil war, Kiir and Machar entered negotiations mediated by Uganda and Sudan in June 2018. Later that month, they signed the Khartoum Declaration of Agreement, which included a ceasefire and a commitment to negotiate a power-sharing agreement to end the conflict. This agreement was followed by a peace agreement to end the civil war signed by the government, Machar's opposition party, and several other rebel factions. In a symbolic moment, Machar returned again to Juba and shook President Kiir's hand, and he made amends to signal a new chapter of peace. However, trust was low and many armed groups remained outside the agreement. While the permanent ceasefire largely held, local violence persisted. In February 2020, a transitional government of national unity was finally formed, with Kiir as president and Machar as first vice president, alongside several other vice presidents. This unity government marked a hopeful step towards stability. Refugees slowly began to trickle home, and some displaced families left UN protection camps. But South Sudanese leaders continued to drag their feet when it came to implementation of the peace deal. Plans to unify the army and militias into a national force continued to stall, as did the creation of a new constitution and accountability for war crimes. Communal violence flared in parts of the country as local feuds and rogue commanders feared insecurity. Meanwhile, the economy remained in shambles. Oil production had fallen and global oil prices were low, leading to a cash crunch. And to make matters worse, South Sudan faced severe natural disasters in 2020 and 2021 as floods submerged entire villages in consecutive years. By 2022, 2 million people remained refugees abroad and millions more were internally displaced or dependent on food aid. Yet, there was no stability in the country's leadership to address the problems facing the people. The transitional period was meant to lead to national elections after about 3 years, but little progress was made on key prerequisites. Citing incomplete reforms and insecurity, the unity government extended the transitional period by 2 more years in 2022, postponing elections that had been slated for 2023. As the leaders continued to delay the transition, tension was beginning to build again. Despite a ceasefire at the national level, violence persisted in pockets of the country, from deadly cattle raids and ethnic conflicts to clashes with holdout rebel groups. Soon enough, another conflict broke out in 2023, this time in Sudan between these two generals.
Hundreds of civilians have been killed.
More than 6.5 million people have left their homes.
South Sudan became collateral damage in this new war, as fighting there disrupted the oil pipeline that South Sudan relies on, causing a shutdown of oil exports and a sharp economic contraction. Things continued to move from bad to worse for this new nation, almost like it was never meant to be. Then came 2025, and everything is beginning to unravel yet again.
The announcement that President Kiir had dismissed his deputy, along with the entire cabinet, came as a surprise.
Clashes between the South Sudan army and militia with ties to the Vice President Machar's party were first reported in January in western Equatorial State, but things have since intensified. On February 14th, intense fighting erupted between the South Sudanese army and an armed youth offshoot of the White Army, a militia affiliated with the opposition in Upper Nile State. This crisis worsened when, on March 4th, the militia reportedly overran an army base in Nasir, a major town near the Ethiopian border in Upper Nile. Several opposition leaders and allies of first Vice President Machar were arrested the following day, and Machar's house was surrounded by army forces, effectively placing him under house arrest. But this provocation, you see, was not from one party. President Kiir recently dismissed several key government officials in February as part of what he called a cabinet reshuffle. Some of these dismissals were viewed by Riek Machar as violating the 2018 peace agreement. And not long after this disagreement, violence broke out in western Bahr al-Ghazal in protest to these changes. President Kiir had also ordered the redeployment of forces in some areas, leading to violence in regions such as Nasir in Upper Nile. Unfortunately, a United Nations helicopter attempting to rescue soldiers from the area was attacked, and a UN crew member and South Sudanese general were killed. This attack was immediately traced to this group called the White Army, from the same ethnic Nuer community as Machar. This has led to suspicions that Vice President Machar may have had knowledge of this. As this conflict threatens to escalate, different neighboring countries are monitoring the situation. Uganda has since deployed special forces to the country, stating that, quote, "We, the UPDF, that is Ugandan military, only recognize one president of South Sudan, His Excellency Salva Kiir. Any move against him is a declaration of war against Uganda." Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni has previously intervened militarily on the side of Kiir in South Sudan and is looking to continue in that regard should the need arise. Right now, South Sudan stands at a crossroad. The unity government is under growing pressure to deliver, but infighting amongst the leaders is preventing any real progress. The next big milestones are drafting a new constitution, completing the unified army, and holding credible elections by December 2026. But will this happen? Can the leaders of South Sudan put aside their petty desires and personal interests in favor of building a peaceful country for their citizens?